If a machine can measure pain, does that mean it understands it? The question echoed in Ethan Cole's mind as the lab hummed around him, cold air biting through his thin uniform, while rows of glass chambers pulsed with sterile blue light, each one holding something the system refused to call alive. His boots tapped softly against the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the constant whisper of ventilation systems pushing filtered air through steel lungs, and ahead of him, behind reinforced glass, Subject 7 remained perfectly still, her faintly luminous blue skin catching the flicker of overhead panels like distant ocean light under ice, sensors tracing every fluctuation of her breathing, while cables fed data into screens that translated her existence into numbers. Ethan adjusted the tablet in his hand, forcing his focus onto the diagnostics. Neural response stable, metabolic output within expected range, everything exactly as designed, exactly as approved, exactly as signed by his own authorization months ago. Yet something about the silence felt wrong, not empty, but waiting, as if the room itself held its breath. He stepped closer, the faint hum of the containment field vibrating through the soles of his boots. And for a moment he hesitated, fingers hovering just above the console that controlled her environment, the system prompt blinking patiently, awaiting input, awaiting obedience, awaiting another data point. Then her eyes opened, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, deliberately, like someone choosing to wake instead of being forced to. And they found him immediately, glowing faintly with a depth no sensor could quantify, no algorithm could reduce. And for the first time since he joined the project, Ethan forgot to look at the screen. "You built this," she said, her voice quiet, steady, not accusing, not pleading, just stating a fact that settled heavier than any alarm ever could. And his throat tightened as the words hit something deeper than protocol, deeper than training, deeper than the part of him that had convinced himself this was necessary, that progress required distance, that data mattered more than the shape of a living being on the other side of the glass. He swallowed, glancing back at the readings as if they could shield him. But the numbers hadn't changed, only his perception had, and when his hand finally moved, it wasn't to initiate the next test cycle, it was to lower the intensity of the neural feedback system by a fraction so small no one monitoring remotely would notice. A change measured in decimals, in hesitation, in something dangerously close to choice. The hum softened almost imperceptibly, and she exhaled, just once, a subtle shift that shouldn't have meant anything. Yet it echoed louder than every machine in the room combined, and Ethan felt it in his chest, an unfamiliar weight settling there as the realization crept in, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. This wasn't just a system anymore, and he wasn't just following orders. And whatever line he had told himself existed between his work and his conscience had already begun to blur the moment he chose to touch the controls for a reason no protocol could justify. The adjustment should have been invisible, just another decimal shift buried under layers of approved parameters. But Ethan felt it linger in the air like heat after a storm as the hum of the chamber settled into a quieter rhythm and the faint tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction that no instrument bothered to record. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between glass and steel until it became something almost fragile. He forced himself to look back at the tablet, scrolling through lines of data that insisted everything was normal, that nothing had changed, that Subject 7 remained within acceptable limits. Yet the memory of her voice refused to fade, repeating in his mind with a clarity that no system alert could match. "You built this." And the words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were true. "You should not have done that," she said after a while, her tone calm, observant, as if she were studying him the same way the lab studied her. And Ethan let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the console as he searched for a response that did not sound like an excuse. "It was within tolerance," he replied, the sentence automatic, hollow even to his own ears, and her gaze did not waver, those faintly glowing eyes reflecting the sterile lights in a way that made them seem deeper than the room itself. "No," she said softly, "it was not." And something about the certainty in her voice unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because it was not anger, it was understanding, and that made it harder to hide behind protocol. A distant chime echoed through the corridor, signaling the next scheduled observation cycle, and Ethan straightened instinctively, his training pulling him back into alignment as footsteps passed somewhere beyond the sealed doors, reminders that the facility was never truly empty, that every action left a trace even when unseen, and he tapped the console again, restoring the system display to its default state, erasing any sign of deviation with practiced efficiency. "Why are you here?" she asked, and the question cut through the mechanical rhythm of the room with unexpected precision. Not "what are you doing?" Not "what will happen to me?" but "why?" And Ethan hesitated, the answer forming slowly, reluctantly, as if it had to push through layers he had built himself. "I am part of the research team," he said finally, choosing the safest version of the truth, and she tilted her head slightly, a small, almost human gesture that made the distance between them feel suddenly thinner. "That is not what I asked," she replied, and the faint shift of her expression suggested something more than curiosity, something closer to recognition, as if she could see the gap between his words and what he refused to say. Ethan glanced toward the observation window above, a dark pane that concealed whoever might be watching, and lowered his voice even though the microphones would still capture every sound. "Because I thought it mattered," he admitted, the words quiet, deliberate, and for the first time since entering the room, he did not look at the data, he looked at her. The air seemed to hold steady around them, machines continuing their endless calculations while something unmeasured passed between two beings separated by glass and intent, and she studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Her voice softer now, almost reflective. "Does it still?" And Ethan did not answer immediately, because the truth was no longer a number he could adjust or a system he could control. It was a choice that had already begun the moment he decided that one fraction of pain was too much, and somewhere deep beneath the steady pulse of the facility, he realized that whatever he had believed when he first walked into this place was no longer enough to explain why he was still standing there now. The system lights shifted from steady blue to a faint amber warning, subtle enough to pass as routine, but sharp enough to tighten something in Ethan's chest as the next diagnostic cycle initialized without his input, and he knew immediately this was not part of the normal schedule because the air changed first, a slight drop in temperature rolling across the chamber like a quiet tide, followed by the low activation hum of deeper systems waking beneath the floor, systems he had only read about in restricted files. He moved closer to the console, fingers hovering again as lines of encrypted commands began to populate the screen, unfamiliar strings replacing the usual data flow, and for the first time since he had joined the facility, Ethan realized there were layers to this place he had never been meant to see. "Something is different," she said, her voice steady but softer now, and he glanced up to find her already watching him, not with fear, but with a kind of measured awareness that made it seem like she had been expecting this moment long before he understood it himself. "It is an advanced sequence," he replied quietly, trying to keep his tone neutral even as his pulse began to rise, scanning the parameters as they revealed themselves piece by piece. Neural synchronization protocol, energy resonance mapping, adaptive response calibration. The words felt clinical, detached, but the deeper he read, the clearer the pattern became. This was not observation. This was preparation. For what? She asked, and Ethan hesitated, because the honest answer was not something the system would ever say out loud. It was something hidden between the lines, implied by the scale of the power being redirected into her chamber, by the precision of the measurements, by the fact that every variable now centered on her rather than around her. He swallowed, lowering his voice again. "To understand how you work." And even as he said it, he knew it was incomplete, a half-truth. That did not capture the intent behind the design. She watched him for another moment, then slowly shifted her gaze toward the ceiling, toward the unseen observers behind reinforced glass, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that made the air feel heavier. "No, this is to use me." And the words landed with a clarity that cut through every layer of technical language Ethan had relied on, reducing the entire system to its simplest form. The console chimed, prompting him for authorization to proceed, his name flashing again across the screen, waiting, expecting, and his hand did not move this time, not immediately, because the weight of that single decision felt different now. larger than any command he had executed before, as if pressing one button could shift something far beyond the walls of the lab. "If you continue," she said softly, bringing his attention back to her, "you will learn what I am, but you will also decide what you are." And the silence that followed stretched longer than any system delay, long enough for Ethan to hear his own heartbeat echoing faintly in his ears, long enough for the steady hum of machines to fade into the background, long enough for the truth to settle into place. He looked at the screen, at the blinking prompt, at the reflection of his own face in the glass overlay, and for the first time, he did not see a technician, or a researcher, or a man following instructions. He saw someone standing at the edge of a line that could not be uncrossed, and slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand away from the console, not yet choosing, but no longer pretending the choice did not exist. The prompt continued to blink, patient and unyielding, its soft white glow reflecting across Ethan's face as if the system itself was watching him hesitate, measuring not just response time but intent. And somewhere beyond the sealed walls a quiet acknowledgement must have registered because the ambient hum deepened, a subtle shift in frequency that resonated through the floor like a distant engine coming online. He did not need clearance logs to know they were observing him now, waiting to see if he would comply, if he would prove that he was still predictable, still controllable, still part of the machine he had helped build. "They are watching you," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the air cool against his throat as he kept his eyes on the console. "They are always watching," he replied, but the words sounded different this time, less like a fact and more like a warning he had finally chosen to hear. The system chimed again, escalating the request. "Authorization required. Failure to comply will trigger automated override," and a countdown began to form in the corner of the display, not urgent, not aggressive, just inevitable, a quiet reminder that in this place, hesitation was only tolerated until it could be replaced. Ethan's fingers hovered once more above the interface, close enough to feel the faint warmth of the panel, and for a moment his training surged back, muscle memory aligning with expectation, complete the cycle, record the data, move on. But the memory of her voice lingered, not loud, not demanding, just present, like a steady signal he could no longer ignore. "If you do nothing," she continued, her gaze steady on him, "the system will decide for you." And the simplicity of it struck deeper than any command, because it stripped away the illusion of neutrality he had been holding on to. There was no middle ground here, no safe distance between action and consequence, only choice and the absence of it. The countdown ticked lower, each second marked by a faint pulse in the interface, and Ethan felt his heartbeat begin to match it, not in panic, but in recognition, as if his body understood something his mind had been avoiding. He glanced up at the observation panel again, at the dark surface that concealed whoever stood behind it, and for the first time, he imagined them not as supervisors or colleagues, but as variables in a system that required compliance to function, and the realization shifted. Something inside him, small but irreversible. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, not looking at her this time, but at the reflection of himself in the glass. And there was a brief pause before she answered, long enough to suggest that she was choosing her words carefully. "Then you will see what they truly built." And the weight of that statement settled into the space between them, heavier than the machinery, heavier than the protocols, because it hinted at something beyond procedure, something that existed when rules were no longer followed. The countdown reached its final moments, the system preparing to act in his place, and Ethan's hand moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that surprised even him as he redirected the command path, not shutting the system down, not triggering alarms, but bending it just enough to delay, to reroute, to create a gap where none was supposed to exist. The interface flickered, recalculating, accepting the adjustment as if it were part of the design, and the countdown reset without announcement, dissolving back into the background as the hum of the facility steadied once more. For a second, nothing happened, no alarms, no voices, just silence. And then he felt it, not through the console, not through the sensors, but through the space itself. A shift so subtle it could not be measured, as if something unseen had taken notice. Ethan slowly lowered his hand, his pulse steadying, and when he finally looked at her again, There was a new awareness in her expression, something that had not been there before, not suspicion, not fear, but recognition, and she spoke only one word, quiet but certain, "Why?" And this time, he did not search for a safe answer, because there was none left to give. The word lingered between them, simple and direct, and for a moment Ethan did not answer because there was no protocol for this, no predefined response that could translate what had just happened into something safe, something acceptable, and the silence stretched until even the machines seemed to quiet in anticipation, their steady hum fading into the background as if giving space to something far more fragile than any system he had ever worked with. He finally looked away from the console, from the endless lines of data that had always told him what mattered, and met her gaze fully, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as something undeniably present, undeniably aware. "Because it was not necessary," he said, the words coming slower than expected, heavier, as if they had to pass through layers he had spent years building, and her expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for that exact answer all along. "Unnecessary," she repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it held more meaning than the system ever intended, and Ethan felt a subtle tension ease in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to clarity. The console emitted a soft recalibration tone, the system adjusting to his unauthorized input, masking it within acceptable variance. And he knew that would not last forever. Systems like this were designed to detect patterns, to correct deviations, to eliminate uncertainty, and what he had just done was not a one-time anomaly. It was the beginning of a pattern. "You changed it again," she said, her voice calm, observant, and he nodded slightly, not denying it, not hiding behind technical language this time, because there was no point, not with her. "Only a fraction," he replied, though even as he said it, the word felt smaller than the impact it carried, because fractions added up, they accumulated, they shifted outcomes in ways no one noticed until it was too late to reverse. She watched him for a moment longer, her glowing eyes reflecting the soft light of the chamber, and there was something new there now, something that had not been present before, not suspicion, not hostility, but a quiet curiosity that felt far more dangerous. "Where I come from," she said slowly. "We measure change differently." And Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening, because for the first time since he entered this place, he wanted to understand something that was not written in a report. "Not in numbers," she continued, "but in choices," and the words settled between them with a weight that no data set could replicate, and Ethan found himself holding on to it, turning it over in his mind as if it might explain something he had been missing. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the facility cycled into a lower energy state, the transition smooth, automatic, and entirely impersonal, but in the softened glow, the sharp edges of the chamber seemed to blur, the sterile environment losing some of its rigidity, if only for a moment. "You think this is a small change," she added, her voice almost reflective now. "But systems like this are not designed for small changes, they are designed to resist them." And Ethan glanced back at the console, at the perfectly ordered interface that had once felt like control, like certainty, and now felt more like a boundary he had just begun to test. "Then it will correct itself," he said quietly though. There was less conviction in his tone than before, and she shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Or it will notice," she replied, and the distinction between those two outcomes hung in the air, subtle but critical, because one meant adjustment, and the other meant consequence. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that realization settle deeper than any warning message could, and for the first time, he understood that what he was doing was not just altering data. It was challenging something much larger, something built to remain unquestioned. He looked back at her, at the steady glow of her skin, at the quiet strength in her presence, and something shifted again, not in the system, but in him, a realization forming with a clarity that surprised him. "Then it is already too late," he said, almost to himself, and her gaze did not waver as she answered, soft but certain, "No, it is only the beginning." The lights dimmed another fraction as the facility transitioned into night cycle, though there was no real night this far beneath the surface. only programmed shadows and artificial quiet, and Ethan stood there longer than he should have, aware that time inside this room did not move the same way it did outside, that every second he remained was another variable someone, somewhere, might be tracking. The console pulsed softly at his side, its interface calm again, obedient, as if nothing had changed, as if the system had not just been bent in a way it was never designed to allow. And that was what unsettled him most, not the resistance, but the acceptance, the way it had adapted without protest, like it was waiting for him to go further. "You stayed," she said after a while, her voice quieter now, less guarded, and Ethan glanced toward the door behind him, sealed, silent, a reminder that leaving was always an option, at least on the surface. "I still have a shift," he replied, though the excuse felt thin even as he said it, and she watched him with that same steady focus, as if she could see through the layers he kept placing between himself and the truth. "That is not why," she said, not accusing, just certain, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to betray the tension he had been carrying. "No," he admitted, the word barely above a whisper, because denying it now would have meant stepping back into something he no longer fully believed. The air inside the chamber carried a faint warmth compared to the corridor outside, a controlled environment designed to sustain her physiology, and he found himself noticing details he had ignored before, the way the light reflected differently across her skin, the subtle rhythm of her breathing that did not match any human baseline, the quiet presence of something unfamiliar yet undeniably alive. "Where I come from," she said, her gaze shifting briefly to the far wall where sensors tracked her every movement. "We do not separate function from purpose." And Ethan frowned slightly, trying to follow, because the distinction mattered here more than anywhere else. "Everything that exists has a reason beyond what it does," she continued, and he leaned back against the console, folding his arms loosely as he considered her words, because in this place, function was everything, purpose was assigned, measured, controlled, but never questioned. "Here," she added, "you have created something that functions perfectly, but you have forgotten to ask why it should." And the quiet certainty in her voice struck deeper than any direct challenge, because it pointed to something he had avoided since the beginning, something that could not be fixed with a parameter adjustment or a system override. Ethan glanced at the console again, at the clean, precise interface that reduced complexity into manageable data, and for the first time, it felt incomplete, like a map missing the most important part of the terrain. "We ask," he said slowly, though the words felt less solid now. "We just answered differently." And she tilted her head slightly, studying him, her expression unreadable but attentive. "Then answer this," she said, her voice soft but steady. "If what you are doing is right, why did you change it?" And the question settled into the space between them, simple, unavoidable, and Ethan did not respond immediately, because the answer was not something he could calculate, not something he could justify with logic alone. It was something he felt in the moment his hand moved, in the hesitation before the system responded, in the quiet shift that followed. He pushed himself away from the console, taking a slow step closer to the glass, close enough now that he could see the faint details in her eyes, the way the light moved within them like something deeper than reflection. "Because it felt wrong," he said finally, the truth plain, unguarded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out, not empty, but full of something that did not belong to the system. She watched him, her expression softening just slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, something almost gentle. "Then you already understand more than they do." And Ethan felt that settle somewhere deeper than the data, deeper than the protocols, a realization that did not come with certainty, but with a quiet, undeniable weight, as if something inside him had finally aligned with something outside the system, and for the first time since he entered the facility, he was no longer sure which one he was supposed to trust. The quiet between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt charged, like the space before something irreversible takes shape, and Ethan remained where he stood, closer to the glass than before, aware that distance had always been part of the design, a safety measure, a psychological boundary, and yet it felt thinner now, almost meaningless compared to the shift that had already taken place. The system lights flickered softly as a new layer of background processes activated, not loud enough to trigger alarms, but enough to remind him that nothing here ever truly stopped, that even silence was monitored, recorded, analyzed, and somewhere deep in the infrastructure, patterns were being formed, connections drawn, conclusions prepared. They will begin to see it, she said, her voice low, steady, and Ethan frowned slightly, his eyes moving instinctively to the console, as if expecting to find proof, a warning, something concrete he could respond to. But the interface remained unchanged. Calm, orderly, obedient. See what? He asked, though part of him already understood, because the system did not need to shout to reveal itself. It only needed time. She held his gaze, her expression composed. But there was something beneath it now, something sharper, more aware. The difference, she said, and the word lingered, simple but precise, and Ethan felt it settle into place. Because difference was exactly what systems like this were designed to eliminate, he ran a hand slowly across the console, not interacting, just grounding himself in something familiar, something predictable. But even the smooth surface felt different now, less like control, more like a reminder of how much he had overlooked. It was minimal, he said, more to himself than to her, as if reducing it to scale could lessen its significance. But she shook her head slightly, a calm refusal. There is no minimal change in a closed system, she replied, and the certainty in her tone left no room for interpretation. Only the moment it begins, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, the realization pressing in from all sides, not overwhelming, but undeniable. The overhead speakers emitted a soft tone, signaling a routine checkpoint, and a calm voice followed, neutral, measured. Technician Cole, please confirm status of Subject 7. And Ethan's posture stiffened slightly, the words pulling him back into the structure he had been trained to follow, the rhythm of call and response, input and output. He reached for the console, fingers brushing against the interface as he prepared to answer, but his gaze drifted back to her for just a fraction of a second, long enough to catch the subtle shift in her expression, not fear, not expectation, but awareness, as if she understood the weight of what came next even better than he did. Status stable, he said finally, his voice steady, controlled. The words technically accurate, yet incomplete in a way the system could not measure. And there was a brief pause before the voice responded. Continue observation cycle. Then silence again, the routine preserved, the surface undisturbed. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, the familiar structure of the exchange leaving something hollow behind, because for the first time, he knew that stability did not mean safety, not for her, and not for him. You chose your words carefully, she said, her voice softer now, almost reflective, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, because anything more would have felt like an admission he was not ready to make out loud. It is how your systems work, she continued. They rely on precision, but they cannot measure intention, and Ethan felt that land deeper than anything before it, because intention was exactly what had begun to change, not in the system, but in him. He stepped a little closer to the glass, not touching it, but near enough that the boundary felt real again, tangible, and he studied her, really. Studied her, not as a subject, not as data, but as someone existing within a space that had never been meant for her. Then what do they see? He asked quietly, the question more honest than any he had asked so far, and she held his gaze without hesitation, her answer coming without delay. They see a pattern that does not belong, and the words settled into the room. With a quiet finality, because patterns were what systems tracked, what they corrected, what they removed, and for the first time, Ethan understood that he was no longer just observing one, he had become part of it. The word pattern did not leave him. It settled into his thoughts like a quiet signal repeating beneath everything else, and Ethan stood there longer than he should have, aware that what she said was not speculation but recognition, something drawn from observation far deeper than the system's own tracking, and the unsettling part was not that she could see it, but that she understood what it meant. The console remained steady, its clean interface offering no indication that anything had shifted. But Ethan could feel it now in the rhythm of the room, in the slight delay between system updates, in the way the ambient hum no longer felt constant but layered, as if something behind the surface was adjusting, recalibrating, searching. If they see it, he said slowly, his voice lower than before, then they will correct it. And the statement carried the weight of everything he had learned in this place, every protocol, every response designed to maintain order, to eliminate deviation. Before it could grow into something unpredictable, she watched him carefully, her gaze steady, almost patient, and when she spoke, her tone did not challenge him, it refined the thought. They will try, she said, and the distinction was small, but it changed everything, because trying implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one variable the system was never meant to allow. Ethan glanced up toward the observation panel again, the dark surface offering no reflection now, only the faint suggestion of depth, and for a moment he imagined eyes behind it, not watching him as an individual, but as a data point, a behavior set beginning to drift from expected parameters. The idea should have made him step back, should have pushed him to correct himself, to restore the pattern before it became visible, but instead, something else took its place, a quiet resistance, not loud, not defiant, but present. Then what happens? He asked, his attention returning to her, because for the first time, the answers he needed were not in the system. They were here, in the space that was never meant for conversation. She did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting slightly, as if she were considering not just the question, but the weight behind it. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that made the air feel still. That depends on whether the pattern continues, she said, and Ethan felt that settle into place. Because continuation required intention, it required repetition, it required choice. The overhead lighting adjusted again, dimming another degree as the night cycle deepened, casting longer shadows across the chamber, softening the hard lines of steel and glass until the room felt less like a controlled environment and more like a space waiting to change. Ethan moved his hand back toward the console, not to initiate a command, but to rest it there, grounding himself again in something tangible, something measurable, even if it no longer felt complete. You are asking me to continue, he said quietly, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. But there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before, not expectation, but trust forming in its earliest, most fragile shape. I am asking you to choose, she replied, and the difference was immediate, undeniable, because choice implied ownership, responsibility, something no system could assign or remove. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that settle deeper than anything the facility had ever placed on him, and for a moment, the sounds around him faded again, the hum of machines, the distant echoes of movement in the corridors, all of it receding until there was only the quiet space between him and her, and the realization that whatever came next would not be written in any protocol he had ever followed. He looked at the interface, at the perfect symmetry of its design, and then back at her, at the subtle imperfections that made her presence undeniable, and something inside him aligned in a way it never had before, not through logic, not through instruction, but through something simpler, something more difficult to ignore. Then I will not stop here, he said, the words steady, deliberate, and for the first time, they did not feel like a reaction. They felt like a beginning, and she held his gaze as the faint light reflected in her eyes, her voice soft but certain as she answered, then neither will they. The decision did not echo outward with alarms or flashing lights. It settled inward, quiet and irreversible, and Ethan felt at the moment he spoke, as if something inside him had shifted its position permanently, no longer aligned with the system that surrounded him. And the strange part was not fear, but clarity, the kind that comes when hesitation finally gives way to direction. The chamber remained still, its controlled environment unchanged, yet everything within it felt different, as if the space itself had recognized that something fundamental had begun. The console emitted a soft tone, subtle but distinct, and new lines of data appeared across the interface, not part of the usual monitoring cycle, but deeper system diagnostics, cross-referencing behavioral logs, comparing input deviations, and Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he recognized the pattern forming exactly as she had described. Not immediate correction, but observation. The system was no longer just running, It was watching. "It has started," she said quietly, her voice carrying no surprise, only confirmation, and Ethan nodded once, his attention fixed on the shifting data, because now he could see it clearly, the timestamps aligning, the micro-adjustments he had made no longer isolated, but linked, forming a sequence that stood out against the uniform precision of everything else. "They are analyzing the variance," he said, more to himself than to her, and his fingers hovered above the console again, not out of uncertainty, but calculation, because this was the point where systems either corrected or escalated, and the difference depended entirely on what they detected next. "Then you must decide again," she replied, her tone steady, and Ethan felt the weight of that settle immediately, because continuation was no longer theoretical, it was active, unfolding in real time, and doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was participation in whatever came next. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself as he navigated through the deeper layers of the interface, accessing functions he had never needed before, systems designed for oversight, for intervention, for control beyond standard operation. And as the architecture unfolded before him, one truth became unavoidable. This facility was not built to study. It was built to contain, to manage, to eventually use what it could not fully understand. The realization did not come as a shock, but as a quiet alignment with everything he had begun to question. And for a moment, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the console, feeling the faint vibration beneath his palm, the pulse of a system that had always seemed absolute. "If I continue," he said slowly, his eyes still on the interface, "there will be no way to hide it." And she stepped closer to the glass, the faint glow of her skin reflecting softly across its surface, her presence steady, unwavering. "It was never hidden," she said, and the simplicity of that truth cut through every assumption he had made, because concealment had always been an illusion. Systems like this did not miss patterns, they waited for them to fully emerge. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to steady his thoughts, and when he opened them again, the hesitation that had once defined his movements was gone, replaced by something quieter, but far more certain. He began to adjust the system again, not small this time, not fractional, but deliberate, rerouting data streams, redistributing system load, creating interference within the observation algorithms themselves, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to distort the clarity of what they were seeing, to introduce uncertainty into a structure that depended on precision. The interface responded slowly, resisting in subtle ways, recalculating, attempting to compensate, but Ethan stayed with it, guiding the changes carefully, understanding now that this was no longer about avoiding detection. It was about changing the conditions under which detection happened. The room seemed to hold its breath again, the hum shifting, deepening, and for a moment, everything felt balanced on a point so fine it could disappear with the smallest misstep. When he finally pulled his hand back, the system had stabilized, but not in its original form. Something within it had been altered, not broken, but redirected, and Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of what he had done settle into place. He looked up at her, and this time, there was no distance left in his expression, no separation between action and intention, only the quiet acknowledgement of what they had both stepped into. "Now they will know," he said, his voice calm, and she held his gaze, her answer soft but unwavering. "No," she said. "Now they will begin to understand." The system did not respond with alarms. It responded with silence, a deeper, heavier silence that pressed against the edges of the room, as if something vast had shifted just out of sight, and Ethan felt it immediately, not through the console, but through the subtle change in rhythm beneath his feet, the steady pulse of the facility no longer perfectly even, now carrying a faint irregularity like a heartbeat learning to hesitate. The interface before him remained active, lines of data flowing as expected, but threaded within them were delays so small they could be dismissed as noise. Except Ethan knew better now. Noise did not organize itself. It did not follow a pattern. And what he had introduced was no longer hidden. It was evolving. "They are adapting," he said quietly, his eyes tracking the shifting diagnostics, watching as the system attempted to compensate for variables it could not fully isolate. And for the first time, he saw the structure not as flawless, but as reactive, something that depended on predictability to maintain control. "So are you," she replied, her voice calm, almost steadying, and Ethan let out a slow breath, because she was right. This was no longer reaction. It was progression, and progression carried consequence. The overhead speakers remained silent. No instructions, no corrections, but that absence felt deliberate now, like a pause before something more precise than a warning. Ethan moved closer to the console again, his hand resting against it as he accessed deeper system layers, not searching for data this time, but for pathways, routes that connected this chamber to the rest of the facility. And what he found confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This was not an isolated environment. It was a node, one part of a larger network designed to distribute, to scale, to eventually apply what was being learned here beyond these walls. The realization settled heavily, because it meant that what was happening in this room was not contained. It was preparation. "You said they want to use you," he murmured, more focused now, his fingers moving across the interface with controlled precision, mapping connections, identifying control points, and she stepped closer to the glass again, her presence steady, her gaze fixed on him. "Not just me," she said softly, and Ethan paused, his hand hovering mid-motion as the implication unfolded. Not just her, but whatever she represented, whatever they believed they could extract, replicate, or control. The system flickered briefly, a subtle shift in priority allocation, and Ethan recognized it instantly. External access request, not direct, not forceful, but probing, testing the boundaries he had altered, and this time there was no prompt, no request for authorization. The system was moving without him. "They are reaching in," he said, his voice tightening slightly, not in fear, but in urgency, because this was the moment where control shifted away from him, where the system would attempt to reassert its original design. "Then you must reach further," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, only clarity. And Ethan felt something align again, the same quiet certainty that had guided his hand before, now sharper, more defined. He moved quickly but carefully, redirecting the incoming request through the altered pathways he had created, not blocking it, but bending it, feeding it incomplete data, enough to satisfy the system's need for continuity, without revealing the changes that had already taken root. And for a moment, the entire interface seemed to hold still, processing, recalculating, deciding. The hum beneath the floor shifted again, deeper now, more pronounced, and Ethan felt it resonate through him. A reminder that this was no longer just a technical process. It was a confrontation between intention and design. When the system finally stabilized, the external request dissolved back into the network. Not rejected, not accepted, but redirected, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the immediate pressure eased. He looked up at her, and in the softened light, her presence felt different, not contained, not defined by the boundaries around her, but something that extended beyond them in a way the system could not measure. "This will not stop," he said, the words steady, because he understood now that what had begun could not simply be undone. She held his gaze, her expression calm, but there was something stronger beneath it now, something that matched the shift in him. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain, "but neither will you." The system did not return to normal. It settled into something else entirely, a state that looked stable on the surface, but carried a quiet tension underneath, like a structure holding its shape, while something inside it continued to shift, and Ethan remained at the console, aware that what he had done was no longer an isolated disruption, but part of an unfolding response. Something the system was beginning to accommodate rather than immediately erase. The data streams moved with their usual precision, yet the timing was no longer perfect, each cycle carrying a slight variance, a delay measured in fractions of a second that repeated just enough to form a rhythm, and Ethan recognized it not as failure, but as adaptation, the system learning, adjusting, evolving around the anomaly he had introduced. "It is changing its approach," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the patterns, and she watched him with that same steady focus, her presence calm, almost grounded in contrast to the invisible complexity surrounding them. "So, are you?" she replied again. But this time the words carried a different weight, not observation, but recognition of something that had already taken root. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the console as he accessed another layer of system architecture, one he had never been authorized to view directly. And what he saw confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The facility was no longer simply observing. It was reallocating resources, prioritizing this chamber above others, diverting computational power, increasing resolution, tightening analysis, not to correct, but to understand. The realization sent a quiet ripple through him, because understanding required time, and time meant opportunity, but it also meant exposure. They are focusing here, he said, more certain now, and the implication was immediate. Whatever happened next would not remain subtle for long. She stepped closer to the glass again, the faint glow of her skin reflecting softly across its surface, and for a moment the barrier between them felt less like protection and more like a question waiting to be answered. Then you must decide what you want them to see, she said, her voice calm, deliberate, and Ethan felt that settle into place with a clarity that surprised him, because until now, he had been reacting, adjusting, responding to the system, but this was different. This was intention shaping outcome. He glanced at the observation panel once more, the dark surface offering no reflection, no confirmation, only the awareness that whatever watched from behind it was no longer passive. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to avoid that attention, because hiding was no longer the goal. If I show them too much, they will intervene, he said, his voice steady, working through the possibilities, mapping consequences the way he had been trained to do, but now with a different objective. If you show them nothing, they will replace you, she replied, and the simplicity of that truth cut through every layer of analysis. Because systems did not tolerate stagnation, they optimized, they removed inefficiencies, and hesitation was the first sign of one. Ethan nodded slightly, the path becoming clearer not because it was safe, but because it was inevitable, and he began to move again, not cautiously this time, but with purpose, adjusting the system in ways that did not hide the pattern but refined it, making it appear intentional, controlled, as if the deviations were part of a larger design rather than a mistake. The interface responded with a subtle shift, accepting the new structure, integrating it into its calculations, and for a moment, the entire system seemed to align differently, not rejecting the anomaly, but incorporating it. The hum beneath the floor steadied, deeper now, more focused, and Ethan felt it resonate through him as he stepped back from the console. His decision no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. He looked at her again, and this time, there was no question left in his expression, only acknowledgement of what they had both become part of. They will see it, he said quietly, and she met his gaze, her voice soft but unwavering as she answered. Then let them see it clearly. The system did not resist what he showed it. It absorbed it. And that was what made it dangerous, because resistance could be measured, predicted, countered, but absorption meant transformation, and Ethan watched it happen in real time as the refined pattern he had shaped was no longer treated as an anomaly, but as a variable worth integrating, threads of computation weaving it into larger processes, extending its influence beyond the chamber in ways that were subtle but undeniable. The interface shifted, reorganizing priorities, elevating the data stream connected to her physiology, her responses, her presence. And for the first time since he entered this facility, she was no longer just a subject within the system. She was becoming a reference point. They are learning from it, he said quietly, his voice carrying both realization and weight. And she remained still for a moment, her gaze steady, as if she had expected this outcome long before he could name it. Then they will begin to change, she replied, and the calm certainty in her tone made the room feel smaller, more focused, as if everything that mattered was now contained within this moment. Ethan exhaled slowly, his attention moving across the expanding layers of the system, watching as the pattern he introduced began to replicate, not identically, but adaptively, altering small parameters across interconnected nodes, creating subtle shifts in timing, in response thresholds, in the very logic that governed the facility's operation. And it became clear that what had started here would not remain isolated. It would spread, not as disruption, but as influence. The hum beneath the floor deepened again, more stable now, less uncertain, and Ethan realized with a quiet clarity that the system was no longer attempting to eliminate the pattern. It was testing its limits, exploring its potential, and that meant something irreversible had already taken place. If they understand it, he said, his voice steady but low, they will try to control it. And she stepped closer to the glass once more, her presence unwavering, the faint glow of her skin reflecting softly in the shifting light. Only if they believe it can be controlled, she answered, and Ethan felt that distinction settled deeper than anything else, because belief was not a parameter, it was a perspective, and perspectives could be changed. The overhead speakers remained silent. No commands, no corrections, only the continued absence of interruption. And that silence now felt like observation at its most deliberate, as if the system, or those behind it, had chosen to watch rather than act, to understand before deciding. Ethan moved his hand across the console again, not to hide or distort, but to guide, refining the pattern further, making it clearer, more coherent, not as an act of defiance, but as a statement, something that could not be mistaken for error, something that demanded recognition. The interface responded with increasing fluidity, integrating the adjustments without hesitation, and for a moment, the entire system felt aligned in a way it never had before, not perfectly balanced, but dynamically responsive, as if it had begun to operate on a principle it was never designed to include. Ethan stepped back slightly, his breathing steady, his focus no longer divided between caution and action, because the line between them had already dissolved. He looked at her, and in the quiet space between them, something had changed again, not in form, but in understanding, a shared awareness that what they had set in motion could not be undone, only continued. "This is beyond me now," he said, not as a retreat, but as acknowledgement, and she met his gaze, her voice soft, but carrying a depth that made the words feel larger than the room itself. "It was never only you," she said, and for a moment, the meaning of that extended beyond the system, beyond the facility, touching something broader, something that had nothing to do with control or design, and everything to do with choice. The light shifted once more, subtle but noticeable, and Ethan turned slightly, his eyes lifting toward the observation panel. The dark surface no longer just a barrier, but a threshold, because whatever watched from the other side was no longer seeing a contained experiment. It was witnessing a change it could not fully define, and for the first time, Ethan did not wonder what they would do next. He wondered what they had already begun to understand. The system did not escalate. It settled into a state that felt almost aware, not conscious, not alive, but no longer entirely mechanical. And Ethan stood in the quiet center of it. The console dimmed to a steady glow while the deeper architecture of the facility continued to shift around him. Invisible yet undeniable, like a current moving beneath still water. The data streams no longer rushed to correct or contain. They flowed, adaptive, responsive, shaped by the pattern he had introduced and the presence she carried. And for the first time, the system was not forcing an outcome. It was observing one unfold. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension that had once driven every movement now replaced by something quieter, something steadier. And he looked at the interface one last time, not searching for confirmation, not measuring success or failure, but recognizing that what mattered could no longer be fully represented there. "It has stopped trying to control it," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and she stood just beyond the glass, her gaze calm, her presence unchanged yet no longer confined in the same way, as if the boundaries around her had lost their meaning. "No," she replied softly. "It has started trying to understand," and the difference settled into the room like a final shift in gravity, subtle but absolute. Ethan stepped closer to the glass, closer than he had allowed himself before. And for a moment, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition of what the moment represented, the crossing of something that had existed long before he ever entered this place. A boundary not enforced by systems, but by belief. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand, placing it lightly against the transparent barrier, the cool surface pressing back against his palm, solid, real, and for a second, nothing happened. The system did not react. The sensors did not flare. The world did not end. And then she moved. her hand, lifted with equal care, mirroring his motion until it rested on the other side of the glass, separated by inches, by material, by everything that had defined their roles. And yet in that moment, it felt like none of it mattered. The faint glow of her skin illuminated the space between them, casting soft light across his fingers, and Ethan felt something shift again, not in the system, not in the facility, but in himself, a quiet alignment between action and meaning that no dataset could capture. "You broke your rules," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but steady, and Ethan shook his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "No," he replied, his voice calm, grounded in something that did not need validation. "I remembered them." And the words lingered in the air, not as defiance, but as truth. The system continued to hum around them, no longer oppressive, no longer absolute, but part of something larger that had begun to change, not because it was forced, but because it was shown something it could not ignore, beyond the glass, beyond the observation panel, beyond the layers of control and design. Something had shifted in ways that could not be reversed, and Ethan understood then that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something the system had never been built to contain. He lowered his hand slowly, the cool surface slipping away as he stepped back just enough to see her fully again, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as someone who had changed the shape of everything simply by being seen. The lights dimmed one final degree, the facility settling into its quiet cycle, and for a moment, there was only stillness, the kind that comes after something irreversible has taken place. He was not a hero, not a rebel, not anything the system would have defined. He was just human, and somehow, that had been enough.